Good evening, and welcome to Seton Hall Law School. My name is Kathleen Buzang, and I'm the very proud dean of this institution. We're very grateful this evening for the continuing series sponsored with Seton Hall Law by the Christie Institute, which has been working with us to continue our very proud legacy of graduating students and preparing students for careers and lives in public service. The Christie Institute dedicates scholarships, externships, and bipartisan policy conversations to prepare our students for the future in public service. So this evening, we're very proud to be hosting Secretary Panetta and General Mattis. So with that introduction, I'm pleased to turn over Zoom control to Governor Chris Christie, Seton Hall Law, class of 1987.
Dean, thank you very much, and welcome to everybody who's joined us tonight. I want to thank all the folks here who are supporters of the Institute and the law school, and also those who are on tonight who are just recently finished with their law school exams. Congratulations, take a deep breath and get ready for a really fascinating conversation. It will definitely be better than exams, and there will be no test after tonight's webinar. Let me introduce our two guests. I've heard it said that when people don't need an introduction, don't waste time giving a lot of one. But I will give a brief one first to Secretary Leon Panetta. Secretary Panetta has served in a number of capacities in government. He is also the chairman of his own Institute for Public Policy, where I've also been honored to visit and speak. He has had a 50-year career in public service and has served as a member of Congress, has served in the armed forces, has served as the Director of Office of Management and Budget, as the White House Chief of Staff, as the Director of the CIA, and finally as the Secretary of Defense. And in all those capacities, served with distinction and with honor. And for any of you who are looking for a great book on what public service is all about, I commend to you Secretary Panetta's memoir. It really tells you what government service can really be all about, how rewarding it is. And so, Secretary Panetta, thank you very much for joining us tonight. With us also, we have General Mattis, retired four-star general of the United States Marine Corps, and also a former United States Secretary of Defense. He, too, has had a 50-year career in public service at all of the highest levels of government. He commanded at multiple levels in his 43-year career as an infantry Marine and retired as a four-star general. He was the commander of the U.S. Central Command, directing all the military operations of over 200,000 soldiers and sailors, airmen, Coast Guardsmen, Marines, and Allied forces all the way across the Middle East. And from January of 2017 through January of 2019, he served as Secretary of Defense as well. He is also the author of a great book that I've read and is an extraordinary guide on leadership. So for those of you out there who are thinking about public service, Call Sign Chaos is a great book. We actually did a book event together out in Washington State, his home state, and I got a great opportunity to hear him talk about it that night, but also his whole career, now being at Stanford University's Hoover Institution as well, has been a call to service for his country. General Mattis, thank you very much for joining us tonight as well.
Thank you.
So, as I said at the open, we're focusing on bipartisanship in this institute and trying to bring more civility and bipartisanship to public service. And I think both of you are extraordinary representatives of that. That's why I asked you. Secretary Panetta, I want to start with you in a little historical perspective. What's the biggest difference between today and when you began public service in terms of the conduct of foreign policy, and particularly the relationship between the executive branch where you've served and Congress where you've served, how it worked when you first started and how you see it today, and what are the ramifications for the difference?
Well, thank you, Chris. Let me first of all say thank you for having this kind of lecture series. I think it's really important to provide information to the public on what's happening with our democracy and particularly our national security. I also want to salute all of the students at Seton Hall. Having been through law school and having been able to practice as a lawyer, I can say to all of you that I wish you the best. You've chosen the right profession, and there's an awful lot that you need to do to make sure that we always remain a nation of law. So thank you And I also want to salute the other members of the audience as well. On that question, Chris, as you know, and you pointed out, I've been in public service over 50 years. And I often say that I've seen Washington at its best and Washington at its worst. The good news is I've seen Washington work. I've seen Democrats and Republicans willing to work together. I think it was 1966 when I left the Army. I became a legislative assistant to a senator from California, Republican, Tom Kuechel, a progressive Republican. He was the minority whip under Everett Dirksen. And at that time, there were other Republicans like him from your state, Clifford Case, from other states like New York, Jacob Javits, Hugh Scott from Pennsylvania, George Aiken from Vermont, a number of Republicans like that who work with their Democratic counterparts. People like Jackson from Washington, work with Fulbright, Dick Russell, Sam Ervin. And yes, they had their political differences, but they worked together on major issues. And that was particularly true when it came to defense issues and national security. They really followed Arthur Vandenberg, the former senator from Missouri, I believe, who basically said that politics should end at our nation's shores. And they really behaved that way. They really set aside politics and worked together on defense issues, worked together on national security issues, worked together on treaties. It was really great to see that. And when I got elected to Congress, it was pretty much the same. Tip O'Neill was the speaker, a Democrat's Democrat, working with Bob Michel, who was a Republican, the Republican leader from Illinois. And again, they had their political differences, but when it came to national security issues and defense issues, and for that matter, other issues as well that were important to the country, they thought it was important to work together. And whether it was a Democratic president or a Republican president, I can tell you that we worked very closely with presidents to be able to try to solve the nation's problems. Ronald Reagan, when he was president, it's a Democratic Congress. We passed Social Security reform. We passed immigration reform. We passed tax reform. We passed a great deal of bills for defense and national security. And so it was a great relationship. Today, obviously, with the polarization that we see between the parties, there's an awful lot of division. Now, I do have to say that on defense, we had a great vote on the defense bill. I think it was 88-11 in the Senate. So there still is some bipartisanship with regards to defense and intelligence. But there's also a lot of continuing friction, as we see from the partisanship. A lot of treaties have not been approved by the Senate for years, like the Law of the Seas treaty. We're seeing almost half of the ambassadorships positions have not been filled. This is a year into a new administration. We don't have ambassadors in many of the countries out there. And in addition to that, there's always this sense that when it comes to a defense issue, that it could very well fall into this kind of severe partisanship that we're seeing in Washington today. So it has not encouraged me in terms of looking at the dysfunction in Washington and what that means for our national security. If we can't solve the problems in this country, if our democracy can't work together to be able to deal with those issues, I have to tell you, frankly, that's probably one of the most dangerous threats to our security.
General, you look at it from a bit of a different perspective, not having held elected office like Secretary Panetta has, but as a career military officer, an infantryman. From that perspective, the way the government looked when you first got into the United States Marines and worked your way up the ranks of our nation's military, and how it looks now, what other reflections would you have to what Secretary Panetta had to say?
Well, first of all, thanks for having us on. This is the sort of thing we have to do more of in this country. You can't have a democracy if people aren't willing to talk with one another, listen to one another, and listen with a willingness to be persuaded, not just listen and act like you're listening so you can chalk up the next rhetorical scorching point against your fellow American. I think if I agree with everything Secretary Panetta just said, and we are lucky, frankly, in the national security committees. And I would specifically point out the Senate Armed Services Committee, House Armed Services Committee, and the Senate Intelligence Committee as very bipartisan places. You won't even hear about it much because they do get along, so they don't make headlines all the time. So there are examples of how we can work together. And it's based on how Senator Vandenberg was just quoted by Secretary Panetta, responding to a member of his own party, said, how could you possibly work with that Democrat Truman there in the White House? And he's a conservative Republican. And he says, no, stop right there. Politics stops at the water's edge. The problem is that when a country today is tearing itself apart inside, cannot pass legislation, it is not gaining respect or affection on the international level. And you're not going to be respected internationally if you're not showing respect to each other domestically. And right now, for all of my 45 years of service, almost more than that, watching external enemies, fighting external enemies, I'm more concerned about what we're doing to each other in this country right now than I am with the Russian Navy sailing up the Delaware River, or the Chinese Air Force bombing us. With the way we're tearing each other apart right now, I can imagine our enemies are cheering wildly as they watch what's going on right now. And that's a darned unfortunate situation for us.
It's really, and it's the reason why when I left office that I started this institute, because I generally agree with exactly what you just said, that the internal threat to each other, to our way of life, it doesn't allow us to even continue to be the strong leaders we need to be around the world and set the example, because we're not setting an example right now for how democracy is supposed to work, in my opinion. Let's get into some specific issues. I'll start with you, General Mattis. Do you have a view towards the 2022 Winter Olympics and the Biden administration's decision on a diplomatic boycott? Do you think that's the right thing to do? Should more or less be done in response to China's human rights abuses?
I think it's absolutely the right thing to do. And I don't think the president's done yet on the human rights abuses. I think what we're looking at here, of course, we want our athletes to compete. And I don't think we're dignifying the Chinese government by letting our athletes compete. What would dignify them would be our governmental representatives going there. And I think that's absolutely the wrong thing to do. I mean, I just happened to be reading this afternoon the 14 demands that China has laid on another democracy, Australia. And I'm thinking we wouldn't put up with that. I mean, where do they get the idea they can do something like that? So it goes beyond the specific human rights abuses of their own population to their abuses of the human rights of sovereignty in other nations. But I don't think the president's done with what we're going to do about the human rights issues. But I'm absolutely certain he's doing the right thing by not having governmental representatives go there and show some kind of support, meant or not meant, to a government that's treating their own people the way they're treating, whether it be the Uyghurs or the Hong Kong young people who want the two systems that China promised. I mean, they are violating human rights from one end of the country to the other and fomenting it elsewhere.
Secretary Panetta, your view on the Olympics issue in China?
Well, I'm obviously in concurrence with what Jim just said, but I also think that it's a good time to kind of sit back and look at the human rights issues, because frankly, we just haven't been very good as a country to find effective ways to try to deal with human rights violations. I know we speak to them, we make them part of our talking points when we go abroad and meet with foreign leaders. But I have to tell you that, aside from symbolism and in many ways holding back our cabinet officials and leaders from going to the Olympics, in many ways is a symbolic effort. It does send an important signal. It does send a message. I don't want to conclude that it somehow doesn't have an impact. It does have an impact, but I think we got to think about other ways to try to get at human rights abuses that really hit home. I noticed that the Biden administration is looking at blacklisting some companies in China for discriminating against Muslims and the Uyghurs. I think that carries a lot more impact when you can hit them economically. I think that you're really you're making them pay a price for what they're doing in terms of abusing the Uyghurs and doing the things they're doing in Hong Kong. So I hope that there are additional steps that the Biden administration takes to make very clear that human rights abuses in China have to come to an end.
Well, let's stay on China for a second, Secretary Panetta. Obviously, there have been provocations by the Chinese, provocative flyovers and other actions towards Taiwan. And I know this has been an extraordinarily delicate issue over a number of decades. But where do you see the situation now vis-a-vis Taiwan? And does this inevitably put us on a more adversarial relationship with China? Or are there things that we can do to try to lower the temperature while at the same time protecting Taiwan?
Well, there's no question it's a dangerous moment with regards to what happens with Taiwan, particularly after what China did with Hong Kong. Even though we've recognized a one China policy, we've also recognized that with regards to Hong Kong and Taiwan, that both of these areas should be treated separately in terms of their ability to govern themselves. And that was violated, obviously, with regards to Hong Kong. And now China looks like they're trying to violate it again when it comes to Taiwan. It raises the bigger issue, which is how do we ensure deterrence to try to stop China from taking any action against Taiwan? What do we have to do to establish deterrence? And I think probably the most important thing is that the United States has to operate from strength. There isn't a hell of a lot we can do to convince others to do what's right. But when you're dealing with your adversaries, pretty please doesn't work. You've got to be able to have strength. And I think that in recent years, for that matter, both Russia and China have viewed the United States as being weak and have tried to take advantage of that. Obviously, China is becoming more autocratic with Xi. They're taking bolder steps, not just on Taiwan, but everywhere in terms of trying to deploy their diplomacy, the whole Belt and Road Initiative to try to expand China's influence around the world. They're taking a number of steps, and then add to that what they're doing on the defense side, which is investing in some pretty sophisticated technology and sophisticated weaponry to try to build up their power base. So the United States is going to have to say that there are lines that China cannot cross. We've got to build up, obviously, our defense. We've got to build up our diplomacy. We've got to build up our economy so that it's clear that we are a strong power. And then using that strength, be able to be very direct with China, that we are going to work with our allies in the world. We're going to work with our European allies. We're going to work with our Asian allies to make very clear that there are consequences if China tries to, in any way, invade or undermine Taiwan. That has to be a very clear message. The United States is not simply going to stand back and allow China to do that. Because, very frankly, once you allow China to basically undermine a democracy like Taiwan, that becomes a terrible message to the rest of the world as to what China is going to be allowed to do in the future.
And General Mattis, to build off of one of Secretary Panetta's comments, he mentioned working with our European allies. Do you think, given the economic interdependence between the EU and China, do you think our European allies are willing to follow us on a tough policy towards China as it regards Taiwan? And what challenges do you think we face there with our allies in terms of dealing with the Taiwan situation?
Well, the first thing we have to recognize, I think, Governor, we need to make certain that coin of the realm that we deal with our allies is trust. If we're not employing trust with our allies, if we're not incurring their trust, encouraging their trust, gaining their trust, we're not going to find a whole lot of people willing to line up behind us. And when you give your word on something in this world, you got to live up to it. That's the bottom line. I think that the European Union has been increasingly concerned about China. I think you see a convergence of the European Union nation states and the United States position on the violations of human rights, the violations of sovereignty. And I think that what we have to recognize is, we're the revolutionaries in this world. Democracies are the revolutionaries. We're not the ones you have to wait silently as the autocrats feeling the wind at their backs think they can take advantage of things. We have to expand the competitive space. If we expand it into economic issues, as Secretary Panetta just pointed out, you put the buying power of the European Union, the United States together, throw in India, add the Middle East, and all of a sudden, China doesn't look quite so economically intimidating at that point. So the more we expand the competitive space, we bring allies on board, and we ensure we're working in tandem with them, then the more authoritative our deterrence is in saying, don't think about it. And what we're out to do, when Secretary Panetta and I were back in our farmer jobs as Secretary of Defense, we were out to buy the peace or maintain the peace or sustain the peace or what passed for peace for one more year, one more month, one more week, one more day, while the diplomats work to solve the problem. And I'll give you 3 words that will help us get there: allies, allies, allies. Nations with allies in history have thrived, and nations without allies have withered. So we'd better get back to valuing allies, working with allies, and making very clear what we stand for, and just as clear what we will not stand for. So there's no muted trumpet, there's no misunderstanding, there's no breaches of treaty, there's no betrayals of our word when we give our word to somebody. But I think we can do this. We simply have to quit having doubts about our values and doubt our doubts about our values. We're not in the wrong. We've got to get back to the confidence that we stand for just and responsive government. And by the way, China came to us twice in the 1980s asking for our support on the return of Hong Kong from the British to China. And it was the right thing to do. Colonialism's day had come and gone, and we supported them with the understanding it would be one nation, 2 systems. And they promised us that. So that was not an internal issue alone. They violated the trust with us. And as they have done that, they've seen the people of Taiwan grow very, very much against reconciliation. They've seen other nations pull back from wolf diplomacy. And we're going to have to recognize this reality. And for you young students who are watching this right now, study your law, but study the history of the law too. Study what happened before under treaties. Make certain that you go into these situations with an understanding historically of where people have previously dealt with a similar situation, either successfully or unsuccessfully. So when you give legal advice, you're also giving prudential advice that is informed by history. That is, it's not a perfect answer, but it will give you some of the best questions to ask as you go into your public service.
It's so important, and the lack of appreciation of history in so many parts of our country is something that I think is really damaging our appreciation for what our democracy is and how it was built. And so I think it's a great admonition, General. It's a good segue into the next area of the country when you talk of the world, rather, when you talk about alliances and how we deal with alliances. Let's talk about Ukraine. Obviously, there's some real menacing steps being taken by Vladimir Putin on the border at Ukraine. I'd ask how you would evaluate the U.S. response so far, and how do you think Great Britain, France, and Germany would respond to any aggression by Russia towards Ukraine?
Well, I think anytime we look at a situation like this, you have to look at the leaders involved. And what you have with Putin, you have a bully. I'd like to give you a more dignified, diplomatic kind of term, but you have a bully. And what do bullies do when they get away with something? They do it again. And remember, he's not going to invade Ukraine here coming up if he does so with the 100,000 troops. He will invade them again. He's already invaded them once. And understanding him, he is not Hitler. He's not going to march on Paris tomorrow. But here's a couple of points. Number one, he's a creature straight out of Dostoevsky. He sees Russia surrounded by nightmares, and he goes to bed every night knowing that if there's a democracy right next door, the Russian people say, hey, I'd like to have some of that too. So any democracy, it can be a small country like Lithuania, it can be the Ukraine, that is a threat to him. And so he doesn't know what he'll do right now. He's got a lot of reason to threaten. He probably would set himself back if he invaded. But I think that right now, the European Union and basically the G7 as well, coming out of the last conference they had with the foreign ministers, said, you're going to pay a severe price on economics. And they've got a very good director of their central bank, but she's not that good. If the European Union and the Americans decide to go after Russia economically, they can't handle that. So I think, again, broaden the competitive space. Don't lead with your chin and go right into the Ukraine. Give the Ukrainians the defensive weapons so they can fight like hell and turn this into a bleeding ulcer for Putin if he does do it. But then expand it to the competitive space of economics. And I don't think that Russia can tolerate that blow.
Thank you, General. Secretary Panetta, building off of that, the issue of NATO has obviously been one that's been an irritant between the United States and Russia as it applies to Ukraine. And certainly, at least some of the things we're reading is that Putin would like some type of assurance, guarantee from President Biden that Ukraine will never be permitted to be a part of NATO. What role do you think that issue plays in all of this? And what advice, would you think would be best for the president in terms of trying to navigate those waters of the demands that Putin is placing on the table in return for him not taking aggressive military action?
Well, I think it's really important for the president to stand with NATO and support NATO in this endeavor, which means basically NATO should retain its ability to decide what it's going to do with regards to additional members, and not somehow make a commitment that we're going to limit NATO. It doesn't have to happen tomorrow. It doesn't have to happen this year. But NATO ought to have that ability to ultimately decide who can be added as a member. Look, NATO is one of the most important alliances that we have. And I think it clearly suffered a blow during the Trump administration when the president undermined the relationship with NATO and with our allies. And it created an element of distrust. And I'm glad that President Biden recognized that it was important to show that the United States would be a world leader, that we would go back to our role as world leader. and support the NATO alliance. And we've done that. And it's important that we, together with our NATO allies, send a very clear message to Putin that he will pay a price if he should try to attack the Ukraine. And Jim's right. We're dealing with a bully. He's placed all of these troops along the border in order to try to intimidate both the Ukraine as well as the rest of the world. And I think Jim's right that he's not made a decision whether or not to attack because he knows, particularly with, I think, all of our European allies having made clear that if he does it, he's going to suffer economically. I mean, look, I think the message that should be sent to him, frankly, is you invade the Ukraine, and you can forget having a pipeline for your oil. When we were attacked by the cyber attacks from Russia, one of the things that I was concerned about was that we did not make them pay a price for that. And one thing you can't do with a bully is let him get away with that kind of attack. And so I think it's very important now to make very clear to Putin that he will pay a price and what that price will be if he does it. Because if we do that, we will undermine his economy. I mean, Russia, I guess it was McCain who said Russia is nothing but a gas station. And that's about the simplest explanation of their power at this point is their ability to supply oil. You impact that and you really do undermine the entire economy of Russia. And add to that the fact that there are dissidents in Russia, the fact that the Russian people are being a little more courageous about speaking out against Putin. He does not have a stable situation there. The clear message needs to be you will pay a price. That's the best way to have deterrence here. And it's the best way to make clear that he should not in any way try to move into the Ukraine.
Thank you. And General, can I one more follow-up with you on this? Do you have a view on whether if Russia were to take military action against Ukraine, does Ukraine have the wherewithal to hold them off?
Probably not in the short term, in the sense, could the Russian tanks occupy ground inside Ukraine? Yes, their army, the Russian army is capable, it's big, it's right there, and they have the advantage of being able to logistically put all their preparations in place right there on the border. So the Ukraine is not as powerful. But remember this too, if in fact you make the price high enough, if we have delivered enough, for example, defensive weapons, anti-tank weapons, maybe shoulder-fired anti-aircraft weapons, and every police station has them, and in the event they are attacked, they simply unlock them and hand them out to people, say, go bury them in your backyard, use them when you've got a shot. All of a sudden, you've got an armed country of very proud Ukrainians who are going to turn it into it's like a porcupine. I'm from the Pacific Northwest. The grizzly bear knows he can take on the porcupine and win, but he lets him go by. He says, it's just not worth the pain. We've got to turn that into a diplomatic way, exactly along the line of what Secretary Panetta was saying. And remember this, none of this is happening in isolation. I think the only real strategic value that China sees in a partnership with Russia, they're not natural allies, is if Putin can break the transatlantic alliance, if Putin can break NATO, if Putin can break the EU. If not, all the Chinese need Russia for is as that gas station that John McCain referred to. Now, right now it's a gas station with nuclear weapons, so you've got to be pretty mature how you handle this thing. But there is no reason that we can't actually weaken Russia in the longer term if we handle Ukraine right, and help to break the Russia-Chinese connection as well. Because I don't think China really looks at Russia as anything other than a rump state and an extraction site for things they need. It's not like there's some love lost between these two.
Really good, really well put. Secretary Panetta, let's go to another part of the world. We obviously are seeing some renewed problems on our southern border regarding immigration. But I'd rather talk about this from a foreign policy perspective. What steps should we be taking as a country to deal with our Central American neighbors to try to effectively deal with this issue at its root cause in these Central American countries where people are leaving and trying to come up through Mexico to the American border? How do you assess our country's relationship right now with our Central American neighbors? And do we need to be doing some different things as a way to try to improve those relationships while at the same time making things better for ourselves at the southern border?
Well, Chris, you know, the whole issue of immigration has been very challenging for this country for a long time. And the fact is that what is needed, most importantly, is that I've got to stop this phone from ringing. Let's do that first.
That's leadership, Mr. Secretary. Hang up on him.
You know, the problem, Chris, is that we've had a broken immigration system for a long time in this country. The last time I had a chance to work on immigration was during the Reagan administration, and we were successful at putting together a comprehensive immigration reform bill that dealt with enforcement, it dealt with legalization, it dealt with workers, it dealt with a lot of employer-employee relationships. It dealt with all of the factors that have to be part of a comprehensive immigration reform bill. And we passed it. We passed it on a bipartisan basis. The reality is the system's broken again. And we absolutely need to have comprehensive immigration reform and get that adopted. More importantly, in the absence of the ability of Congress to do that, which we know is the case right now, we need to protect our borders. We need to be able to provide a system to deal with those that are coming in. And I think right now, frankly, the administration has, for whatever reason, not been able to provide the resources or the process necessary to be able to handle the volume at the border, and it's created a chaotic situation that is really hurting the United States, but also hurting those that are potential immigrants to this country. Yes, we need to obviously work with these countries, like Venezuela and the other countries of Central America that, because of the way they operate, are creating an untenable situation for many of their people. I'm not sure that's something we can solve overnight. Obviously, we need to provide aid. Obviously, we need to work with our diplomacy to try to deal with these countries. But the bottom line is we are going to have to get our act together in terms of our ability to process immigrants coming into this country. And yes, there's going to be a lot of immigrants, but I thought the sight of these Haiti immigrants under a bridge and just basically, gathering there without being in any way processed was a terrible message to send to the world about how we're treating immigrants in this country. We need to process them. And I guess I'm from the school that if there's a problem, damn it, you fix it, which means you provide the resources, you provide the support, you provide the personnel, you provide the ability to process those who are trying to come into this country. And yes, there's going to be a lot, but we can process them. We have laws as to how we treat people. And somehow we're not doing that. And that's probably the first thing that needs to be fixed. And then obviously work with Mexico, work with these other countries to try to develop hopefully a better support system so that people will think twice about whether or not they're going to suddenly run to the United States. Now, look, I'm the son of Italian immigrants. I believe our country is a land of immigrants, and I welcome immigrants to this country. I think it's part of our strength. But we've also got to treat them in a humane way. We've got to treat them in a way that represents the values of our country. And right now, that's not happening. So I'm not sure we can say much about other countries without getting our own act together.
General Mattis, you have a view on the relationship with the Central American countries and
Right.
our own handling of immigration that the Secretary was just discussing?
Well, we need to regain control over our borders in a way that allows our laws to be enforced and our values to be demonstrated. Certainly, we can work with our allies down south, from Mexico down into Latin America, who can also do a lot, I think, to help these Central American countries where the quality of life, the economic opportunity is not what it should be. I think we could do a lot to foment private investment, companies investing down there and putting in factories or and other things that we could take advantage of the labor market there and strengthen the North and South American body politic. None of us live on an island alone in this world. I also want to just mention again, especially in light of the young people watching, you heard what Secretary Panetta said they did back years ago. You have not been given an example of this sort of problem fixing in the last 10, 15 years. I mean, we seem to be at each other's throats. And you're in a government that is intentionally set up to be difficult after that nasty argument we had with King George III. And it said, you have got to be willing to compromise. That's everybody compromise. And you're not everything's a matter of principle. A lot of things you just need to fix the potholes, secure the border, and take care of problems. And that's really the message that comes out of here tonight is, doggone it, we've got to work together. And this idea that it's my way or the highway is not consistent with the founding fathers. He said, we're going to set up a tough form of government, but it's going to be the best form going so long as everybody's willing to compromise. We even set up a constitution that required compromise just to get agreement on the Constitution. So what makes us think today that we're so perfect that we don't have to listen to somebody else's idea, that we've got all the right right answers, and then we bridle when they say the same thing back to us? So let's get back to what Secretary Panetta was describing. In the old days, we simply took on problems, defined those problems so well that we all agreed on what the problem was, then we solved it.
That's exactly what we're trying to foster here too, and having you two here is a good step in that direction to show people how to do that by example. Let me stick with you for a second, General. You had mentioned Australia before, and their recent interaction with China. There was the recent submarine sale to Australia by the Biden administration, and that raised some interesting issues regarding our bilateral relationship with China and our relationship with France, who obviously was not real pleased about us displacing them in that submarine sale. What's your view of that entire episode, and what does it say about our alliances with France? And what does it say about what we're trying to do with Australia regarding our adversarial relationship with China?
Well, first on France, I think President Biden said it was clumsy, and that's probably accurate. I mean, we all do that once in a while. We don't mean it. We don't think of the second or third order effect. But at the same time, what you're seeing here really are the implications of China bullying other nations. I mean, I can pretty much guarantee you that Australia would have been quite happy with diesel submarines from France if China hadn't been, bellicose and all this other kind of language about what they're going to do to Australia. They basically declared a cyber war on Australia a year ago now. They cut off many of the imports of beef, wine, that sort of thing. So they're trying to punish China because China said, we think we ought to figure out how the COVID virus started. That's what began this. And the more you start threatening democracies, they're slow to act. Democracies are not eager to go to war or anything like that. Few nations have tried more than Australia to have a mature, healthy relationship with China. They have really tried. And eventually what China did with their demands on Australia, their infiltration of their journalism circles and what they did to say what subjects that they thought could be taught in various universities in Australia. Finally, Australia just said, we need submarines that can go further if we're going to protect our country. And that's what drove this. So in terms of Australia, we couldn't have a tighter bond with a country. In terms of France, the longest term ally we've ever had, we will get over this. We'll get beyond this. And the military to military and intelligence relationships were not harmed by this. France had some domestic political issues that the president had to deal with as well. But we took a hit on our relationship with France. It will not be an enduring one. We have too many things in common, views in common. But Australia made operationally the right decision for their own security.
Secretary Panetta, your view on that situation and how it impacts our long-term competition with China.
Yeah, Chris, this is probably a good point since we've been talking about some of the threats to kind of, just kind of summarize that we're living in a dangerous world with a lot of flashpoints in the world. You've touched on some of those flashpoints, but we're a country that still is dealing with terrorism and the threat from terrorism. And Afghanistan obviously hasn't improved that situation. It's made it worse in terms of the terrorist threat. We're dealing with failed states in the Middle East that are the breeding grounds for terrorism. We're dealing with Iran and their effort to try to develop a nuclear weapon. We're dealing with North Korea, another rogue nation that has nuclear weapons. We're dealing with China and the threat from China. We're dealing with Russia. We're dealing with cyber attacks. We're dealing with a lot of danger points in the world. And if the United States is going to respond to these danger points, it simply has to, as Jim said and I've said, we've got to build alliances, strong alliances. The one thing that our adversaries don't understand is alliances. They're autocrats. They operate on their own, even though they pretend. I mean, I know Russia and China are pretending that somehow they're getting along. They don't know what true alliances are, and people willing to go to bat for their country. We know what alliances are about. So we've got to build strong allies to be able to deal with these threats I just discussed. Whether it's NATO, whether it's building strong alliances with our Arab friends in the Middle East, with Israel, with ASEAN countries in the Pacific. And what we did with regards to Australia is basically reinforcing our alliance with Australia. Australia is a good friend. Australia is part of the Quad relationship with India, Australia, and Japan, and the United States. That's an alliance. And our ability to go to Australia and get them to be able to purchase these nuclear subs makes them that much more protected, that much more secure in terms of dealing with China. So it was a good deal, and it's important for our security. We didn't handle it as well as we should have with France. I think the president's right. It was handled in a clumsy way by not bringing France into that process. But nevertheless, we have a strong alliance with France, and we'll get back to regular order here with them. But it is important that we recognize that we have got to work with our allies if we are going to confront these adversaries like China and Russia and these other threats that we face from these other countries. And the best way to do that is to establish a trusting relationship with our allies. And I can tell you from my own discussions with people in Australia that the fact that we were willing to go to bat with them, the fact that we were able to provide these important assets in terms of protecting Australia, that went a long way to strengthening the relationship between the United States and Australia.
I'm so glad you brought up the Quad, because it seems to me one of the relationships that I don't hear enough discussion about is with one of the countries that's part of the Quad, and that's India. And how important do you think that relationship is, Secretary Panetta? And what should we be doing as we try to get into this more effectively, being combating China in their neighborhood? We talked about Taiwan. We've now talked about Australia. How big a role can India play? How important an ally can they be in attempting to, keep China in check?
India is extremely important to the United States and, frankly, to our security position in the Indochina region. India is a democracy. We have security relationships with India. We have technology relationships with India. We have economic relationships with India. India represents, from my point of view, in the relationship I had with India, both as director of the CIA and as Secretary of Defense, we depended a great deal on India and what they were able to do in helping support us, particularly in the war against terrorism. They were a great friend. So India can be critical to the security of that region. It's a big country. It borders on China, and I think can be an important bulwark against China. A little concerned that India was working with Russia in terms of getting military assistance from Russia. So we have to be careful that other countries don't try to make use of that very important relationship. Now, I don't think they will. I think India, in terms of its values, has a lot more going for it with the United States than with Russia or China, for that matter. But it's a relationship that we have to work on. I think part of the problem is we've kind of taken it for granted. We get a lot of Indians come to this country to work on technology, and it's a very important asset for the United States, and it's an important asset for India as well. And I think sometimes we take it for granted in the relationship, and we have to spend more time basically sitting down with India, having a dialogue with them, talking about what their security needs are, talking about their economic needs, and really building that relationship. I think part of the problem is India has always kind of thought that they were kind of a stepchild when it came to the United States and how we treated India. And I always got that kind of reaction from the Indians that I spoke with there, that they always felt like they were not getting the kind of direct dialogue and help that they needed. We've got to do that because they, working with Australia, working with Japan, and working with our other allies in that region, that can be a very important bulwark against China.
I think you've all been talking about alliances all night tonight, and that's why I put that question in there, because it struck me, Mr. Secretary, I agree with exactly what you just said, that we just haven't paid enough attention to that relationship. And it appears to me from everything they do publicly that they want that relationship and they want it to be even stronger. And sometimes, you take for granted those who are best to you. And I think it's something we may be missing in the relationship with India. And we should be trying to stack up as many chips, in my mind, in that region against China as we can. Keep them occupied with their problems so that they they won't be mingling in ours. Speaking of problems, Mr. General Mattis, I wanted to go to another topic as we near the end of our time. That's very, very current. The UAE has just announced a hold on these F-35s that they're going to buy from the United States supposedly because some of the restrictions that we want to put on the technology in the F-35. News reports say this is with regard to some concerns raised by Israel, despite the fact that the Israeli Prime Minister just made his first state visit to the UAE and met with MBZ as a result of the Abraham Accords that were negotiated during the Trump administration. What's your view of this latest development, and what does it mean? Because we haven't touched on the Middle East at all tonight. It'd be wrong for me not to touch on the Middle East before we. How do you look at the UAE here and this latest move and what we should be doing in response?
Yeah, it really connects back to what Secretary Panetta was just saying about India. You know, the greatest generation came home from World War II saying, what a crummy world. And like it or not, we're part of it. And they created these alliances like NATO. They tied us into Japan. They beat the fascists, and then they welcomed the Japanese, the German, the Italian people back into the community of nations. And what we're seeing with nations like United Arab Emirates, like India, are nations that want to be allied with us. There's a little reluctance on the part of each of them because they're only a generation beyond colonialism. But when you get into a situation like this, you have to recognize that when things change, you have to change with it. The Abraham Accords were lens changing in the Middle East. The idea that Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates would join Jordan and Egypt in recognizing Israel. That last Hanukkah, over 120,000 Israeli tourists went to Hanukkah vacation in Dubai. Now, over 100,000 Jews from Israel ain't stupid, okay? Let's start with that premise. They went there because they know they're welcome. There's Jewish weddings going on in Dubai now. Who would have believed that? The times have changed, so it is not any Israeli reluctance. But I think that's stray voltage in the press. There was that was there before. This is now, and so I think what we have to do is look at this and say, if we want to reduce our military commitment to the Middle East, we'd better make darn certain that our allies and partners have the wherewithal to defend themselves, because they're in about as bad a neighborhood as Poland in 1939. You know, they live next door to Iran, for crying out loud. You've got to give them the attention and the support. And I think that we'll find our way forward. I think it's a serious thing if a nation that we called Little Sparta in the Department of Defense, because they always stuck by us when we were in trouble. It's really concerning if we don't prioritize those nations' values, those nations' concerns, and make certain that we're looking out for them, just like we want them to stand with us when we're in trouble, and just like UAE has stood with us every time we've been in trouble in the past. So I think we'll find our way through this, and I think that we'll see a growing alliance out there between Israel and the Arab state, the moderate Arab states, confronting Iran and the mischief they're trying to conduct in that area, just like we need to do the same, as Secretary Panetta said, with the Indians. And by the way, when I was the Secretary of Defense, I changed Pacific Command to Indo-Pacific Command because I'm not paid to be subtle. Might as well put it right out there. But thanks very much tonight,
Chris.
You've never been accused of subtlety, for sure.
Chris,
Here we got 3 guys on here tonight who have not been accused of subtlety. Yeah. Secretary Panetta, you have anything you want to add on UAE and
I just want to follow up on what Jim said. It's really important that we resolve this issue with the UAE. Look, I think there's been a general sense that somehow the United States is kind of withdrawing from a role in the Middle East. It began with Trump, and there's a sense that perhaps Biden is not as aggressive as we need to be. And the reality is, look, whether we like it or not, the Middle East can impact on our national security. That's the bottom line. Whether it's Iran, whether it's energy, whatever it is, it can affect our national security. And it makes sense for us to try to build strong allies in that part of the world. I've long advocated, and I did this as Secretary of Defense, that we should build a security relationship with moderate Arab countries along with Israel in that part of the world. Because frankly, there are common enemies there. One is Iran and the other is terrorism,
Yep.
Al-Qaeda. And the ability to kind of work together and develop a strong alliance that is able to work on those issues. Plus, I might point out, we've had failed states in the Middle East. We don't know quite how to deal with those failed states, whether it's Yemen or Libya or Syria. The ability to work with other Arab countries who understand those tribal instincts, who understand the need for stability, would be really important to try to create a more stable Middle East than what we have today. So there's a lot riding on this issue. We can't just take it for granted again. We've got to work to make sure that we are working closely with our allies in order to ensure peace in that region.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. What an extraordinary hour to have two people who have been involved at the highest levels of our government for the last 50 years to share your thoughts with our students tonight and with the supporters of our institute. And having it come from, as I said, three guys known for their subtlety and understatement is really quite the trio to put on the Seton Hall Law students and the Christie Institute supporters. But I can't thank you enough, Secretary Panetta, General Mattis, for you sacrificing an hour of your time today, right before the holidays, to do this. The Institute, as I said to you before, it's been hard, as with everybody, with COVID and our ability not to be able to do in-person events. But the response we got to this Zoom event has been extraordinary because of the great respect that people all over the country, and there are people from all over the country signed in tonight, have for both of you. And the only thing that outmatches that is the respect that I personally have for both of you. So, Secretary Panetta, please say Merry Christmas to the whole family. And enjoy it out there, and the same to my two Western friends. Enjoy Christmas, and I look forward to seeing you both in whatever the next context is. I can't thank you enough, and I'll turn it back to Dean Buzang to close out the program. But thank you to two very good friends and two great Americans.
Thank you, Chris, and happy holidays.
Thanks, Chris.
So, Governor, we thank you for making tonight happen. You literally created an extraordinary conversation, enabling Secretary Panetta and General Mattis to demonstrate for all the attendees that common ground does exist, and from that common ground comes productive conversation. So I thank all three of you for making that happen. I wish you Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, and thank you for your new relationship with Seton Hall Law School.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Good evening.